Good morning, everybody from Toronto, and a wonderful good afternoon to Dr. Tamás Stark in the lovely city of Budapest. He's already told me that, or he's hinted to me that there's terrific weather in Budapest. Tamás, I want to tell you that we're having terrific weather here after a pretty, I don't know, let's say uneven spring. And since, updating you in the world of COVID news from Toronto, things are getting a little bit better. Vaccination campaign seems to have picked up some momentum. There's, sense of optimism in the air, which I certainly appreciate. But on behalf of the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, welcome to Toronto, virtually, obviously. But it's for me, it's great to see you again, because by now we're old friends. And just for the audience, this is not the first visit of Dr. Stark to Toronto. This is definitely, Tamás, if I'm correct, this is definitely our first virtual visit. But we put together this series with colleagues at the Hungarian Research Institute of Canada, including Dr. Susan Papp and particularly Dr. Levente Dioshári, and we ran a series throughout the year. And I believe we had about 6 talks in total, including a conference looking at Trianon in the fall. For the 2020-21 academic year, this is our last talk, everybody, but we'll be back at it in the fall. We've already got some good ideas. And I want to thank everybody for, for showing up to these talks. We've covered a lot of ground. We did really well, I think, particularly at the interwar period, but also the wartime period. So Tamás, your talk fits in perfectly. As you know, Tamás, my work, at least in the past, used to deal a lot with Europe between the wars. So what you're doing today is very much up my alley. And the title of the talk is excellent. As you can see, it's an extremely important topic. But before I hand the virtual floor over to Dr. Stark, I just want to say a couple of things about him. I know you have his bio already on the website, but as I said, he's a regular visitor to Toronto. Outside the bio here that you can see, everybody, what I want to say is Dr. Stark, to me, is the best and most leading internationally recognized expert on the movements of people, okay? Particularly during the Second World War, because that's something when I'm doing my own teaching, to remind people, okay, you've got massive destructions of populations, of course, but also to familiarize yourself with the massive movements of people that took place. And I want to highlight particularly Professor Stark's work in the movement of people for forced labor, particularly, because I just finished a monograph. It's actually a popular history, and I had to include that. And of course, when I wanted to talk about what was happening to people during the war and after, in terms of population movements, population transfers, the first expert you turn to is Professor Stark, okay? And he's been a great help to me because he writes, really deep research, and I try to take what deep research is out there and distill a little bit, and so that we can introduce East Central Europe, or Central Europe more particularly, to let's say undergraduate readers or serious travelers. But having said that, I'm going to give you the bio again, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Stark. Just some details. And again, I'm reading here. Tamás Stark received his PhD from Eötvös Loránd University, Faculty of Humanities in 1993. So we're close. I graduated in 97, Tamás, just so you know. So there's a 4-year gap there. From 1983, he was a researcher at the Institute of History of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And in 2000, he was appointed a senior research fellow. As everyone knows who's regular to these talks, we have a really strong association with the Institute of History at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, particularly its former deputy head, Attila Pok, but also Laszlo Borhi and many others. His specialization, as I mentioned, is forced population movement in East Central Europe in the period 1938-1956, with special regards to the history of the Holocaust, the fate of prisoners of war and civilian internees, and the post-war migration, as I just mentioned. In 2014, he was Fulbright visiting professor at the Nazareth College in Rochester, USA. That's, by the way, we used to have a boat, and I think that's where we met Tamás when you were in Rochester, which is just across the lake from us. His main publications include Hungary's Human Losses in World War II, published in Uppsala in 1995, Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust and after the Second World War, 1939-1949, a statistical review that's published in Boulder, and then a Hungarian title, which I'm not going to read because I'm going to brutalize it, but I'm going to give you the English title, The Deportation of Civilians to the Soviet Union in Light of Contemporary Documents. That's Budapest 2017. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the topic today looks at the fate of Jews and the question of citizenship after the First World War. And this is a story that I think is especially important for us to hear from Dr. Stark. Dr. Stark, great to see you again. I like that, as you can see, Dr. Stark's Zoom is better than mine because he somehow gets to insert himself in the slides. We were all looking at that at the beginning, but he's obviously upgraded his Zoom. So Tamás, over to you. Great to see you. As I said, I'll either see you in Budapest in September, but I promise you by the latest December, and we have a nice dinner at the Gerlóci Cafe. Over to you.
Good afternoon from Budapest. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I look forward to see you in Budapest in December, as you mentioned. And I wish I were in Toronto now. It is much more difficult to give a presentation online as in person. So that's a challenge for me. But thank you very much for the introduction. And as you mentioned, the focus of my research work is the Second World War related forced migration, the history of the prisoners of war, and the history of the Holocaust. And years ago, I began to study the history of the deportation of the so-called alien Jews that happened in 1941. That was the first chapter of the history of the Hungarian Holocaust. And this was the first deportation from Hungary. And this subject, I mean the history of the first deportation, stirred up vehement debates among Hungarian historians, debates about the responsibility of the Hungarian government for the death of about 20,000 deported Jews who were killed by German special units in late August 1941. Studying the subject, I realized that if we would like to understand what happened in 1941, we need to go back to the end of the Great War. In other words, the preliminaries of the deportation in 1941 was rooted in the early 20s, or it was rooted in the First World War and the early 20s. Studying the preliminaries of the deportation, of the first Hungarian deportation, a new subject opened up for me, and this is the problem of stateless Jews. And a couple of years ago, I began to deal with this subject, and it is really very interesting, very challenging, and it is also it's fascinating. At first, I would like to tell you the main questions I try to reply in the framework of this talk. I try to reply to the following questions: why and how did East Central European countries create masses of stateless Jews? The second main question: what was the solution of the victorious Entente power to the problem of stateless Jews? And the last big question is, how did East Central European countries purposely violate the commitment they accepted with signing the peace treaties and minority protection treaties? So these are the main questions I am looking answers. I would like to begin my presentation with 3 citations. And the first citation comes from a book of Joseph Roth. I show you the book. Okay. So, yeah, now you can see probably. So the book, it's a little one. It came out in the 20s, and the author of the book, Joseph Roth, is a famous essayist and journalist. He worked in the 20s and in the 30s, and the title of the book, Wandering Jews. And this is his best-known book, which gave a dramatic picture on the stateless Jews in Europe. And the first citation is, it's only a short sentence from his book, papers. Half of the Jew's life is consumed by the futile battle with papers. This is the first citation. In order to describe this situation of statelessness, I will read from an open letter which was written by a Hungarian Jewish leader in Transylvania. And this open letter was published in the daily paper of Hungarian Jews in Transylvania, Új Kelet, on April 1940. And the citation is the following: "My dear Jewish brothers, my voice is not strong enough to get your attention. Nevertheless, I beg each Jewish leader, each rabbi, each teacher, each lawyer to sound in their communities that every Jew must do their best to get what is the most valuable on earth, most valuable thing on earth, Romanian citizenship. We need to call our brothers to account for fulfilling their duties in order to get citizenship." The third citation is also from the Új Kelet daily paper, Hungarian Jewish daily paper. The citation is from an editorial article which was published on 24th of September 1925. And the citation is the following: "Today, having citizenship, especially in the successful states, means life. Man cannot exist without citizenship." I tried to describe this dramatic situation with mentioning these citations. The main question is now, why did papers become so important in the post-war world? I'm speaking on East Central Europe. Why did citizenship become such a valuable thing in a Jewish life in East Central Europe? In the era of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, no one cared whether they formally had citizenship or not. When issuing a passport, authorities did not ask papers about citizenship. Men were recruited to the army during the First World War without checking their citizenship. Papers on citizenship were not necessary to open a restaurant or to establish factories. But this situation changed dramatically in the post-war era. Here I have to emphasize that mostly Jews had to fight for papers, had to fight with papers. In the post-war era, East Central European so-called Christian nationalist regimes, saturated with anti-Semitism, were eager to create tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stateless Jews to make them vulnerable and to expel them. It would be an exaggeration to say that the so-called Jewish question did not exist in Europe before the Great War, but it did not stir up emotions, and anti-Semitism was not a widespread attitude. I'm not speaking about Russia now. But in the post-war world, especially in East Central Europe, the Jewish question became a major issue. Something happened during the Great War. Something happened which changed this attitude. I do not know the reason of this dramatic change. I do not have a clue of what made this dramatic change. Therefore, I limit myself to telling some basic facts. The Jews identified themselves with the war aims of their nation, of their home country. They were as nationalists as their fellow citizens. For Jews who lived in the countries of the Central Powers, it was easy to identify with the war aims. In general, Jews were convinced that the war against Russia served the universal interest of Jewry because it was the only way to liberate Jews from the yoke of the Tsar. Both blocs, Entente powers and Central powers, made serious efforts to gain the support of Jews. In the occupied part of Poland, and I'm speaking on the German occupation of Poland, Jewish life began to flourish. Jews were free to publish Hebrew and Yiddish papers and to establish schools. So it is so dramatic that This was the German policy of occupation during the First World War. And a couple of decades later, so the situation was so dramatically different in Poland. After the defeat in Romania, after the defeat of Romania, the Romanian government had to accept the emancipation of Jews. And I'm speaking on the Bucharest Peace Treaty, which was concluded with the Central Powers. On the other hand, the Entente came with the famous Balfour Declaration. At the end of the Great War, Jewry showed up in the international arena as an independent actor. Eastern European Jewry had such a high prestige that their representatives were invited to the Paris Peace Conference. These representatives established the Committee of Jewish Delegation. It is important to mention that the Committee of Jewish Delegation initiated an effort to solve the problem of statelessness, and this committee worked out minority protection treaties. So it was, the work of this committee was really very influential. Jewish national aspirations were well received at the Paris Peace Talks, and the civil and political rights were guaranteed for Jews in East Central Europe. It seemed that the long era of suppression was over forever, but this success story represents only one side of the coin. Let's see the other side of the coin. A long-standing and a bloody campaign of violence was waged against Jewish communities along the western borderland of Russia. This campaign began in 1950, when retreating Russian troops removed hundreds of thousands of Jews from the war zones to the inner part of Russia. The anti-Jewish campaign reached a new magnitude during the Russian Civil War. About 100,000 Jews were killed in pogroms and in the attacks which swept through in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Poland. I think that the term genocide refers the best to what happened to the Jewish communities in eastern Poland and in Ukraine. I also use the term PreHolocaust when I talk of the fate of Jews in Ukraine and in eastern Poland. In these years, a new element was added to the traditional anti-Semitic worldview. After the Russian Revolution, Jews were identified with communism. This view deeply affected the nature of anti-Semitism in East Central European countries. The wave of violent anti-Semitism also swept East Central Europe. In the early 20s, Hungarian, Polish, and Romanian political elites in power were united in seeing the so-called Jewish question as one of the most pressing problems of the nation. The propagated solutions to the problem was the same everywhere: cutting the influence of Jews in the field of economy and culture, and cutting the number of Jews by expelling the so-called alien Jews. Hungary, and to a certain extent, Romania are in the focus of my talk. The Romanian scene is important not only because the policy towards the Jews was quite similar to the Hungarian policy, but because Romanian regulations about citizenship seriously influenced the fate of Transylvanian Jews after 1940, the northern part of Transylvania was reattached to Hungary. Who were aliens? Who were aliens in Hungary? The aliens were those Jews who came from Galicia fleeing from the advancing Russian army in 1914 and later. This is the first group of aliens. We do not know exactly how many refugees found temporary shelter in Hungary because they arrived in waves and there are no trusted statistics on their numbers. We are speaking about tens of thousands of refugees altogether. But the majority of the refugees left Hungary during the war, and they moved to Moravia, and they moved to Vienna. They tried to settle in Vienna since they were Austrian citizens, and some of the refugees returned to Galicia. But a significant number of them remained in Hungary. And they were well received. The refugees were well received in 1914. But in the last 2 years of the war, they had to face a hostile attitude from a growing part of the Hungarian public. In public discourse, they were charged with profiting from food shortages and from the inflation. In the last year of the war, they became public enemies who were held responsible for all major problems of the country. Journalists, public speakers, members of the parliament began to speak about the invasion of Galicia, and they were also often called as country conquerors. Their influence and their numbers were also exaggerated. Some members of the parliament spoke of 100,000, while others spoke hundreds of thousands of refugees who should be expelled from the country. Nothing really came of this exaggeration at the time, but this anti-refugee, anti-Galician campaign that was the product of frustration, collapse, and despair because of the defeat paved the way for the anti-Semitism of the Horthy regime. It partly defined the nature of the anti-Semitism of the Horthy regime. And to describe the atmosphere of the last year of the war, I would like to show you some cartoons from various Hungarian papers. And this is a cartoon, the title of the cartoon is A Problem. And it is written below the cartoon that we can easily stop the invasion of the Russian army, but we cannot stop the invasion of Jews from Galicia. So at the right-hand side of the cartoon, you can see the column of Russian soldiers, and the Russian soldiers are driven out by the army of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The left-hand side of the cartoon, you can see the column of Jews, Orthodox Jews who came to Hungary crossing the Carpathian Mountains in order so-called to conquer Hungary. And let's see that I have another cartoon, a cartoon about the arrival of the refugees. It is mentioned here that the refugees are arriving in Budapest, and it continues in this way. And the refugees, when we would like to get rid of them, so the Jewish refugees became rich because they profited from the war, from the inflation, from the food shortages, and everybody is cheerful because these Jews were expelled from Hungary. Actually, they were not. And this is the last cartoon that Jewish refugees who became rich in Hungary are driven out by a member of the Hungarian gendarmerie. But there was another group of alien Jews. In 1990 and later, the term alien of Jewish race, in quotation marks, included not only those who really came to Hungary from Galicia during the Great War, but those too who came to Hungary before the war. So we are speaking two groups, refugees who came from Galicia during the war, and the second group includes Jews who were born outside Hungary, but they settled in Hungary, but they were born outside Hungary. And there is a third group of so-called Aryan Jews. Those belong to the third group whose ancestors came from Galicia, mainly in the 19th century. When I'm speaking on these three categories of alien Jews, I would like to emphasize that these are not official categories, but these categories reflect the general idea of the Hungarian public. These categories were widely accepted by the Hungarian political elite. When Nicholas Horthy, the regent of Hungary, or Paul Teleki, the prime minister of Hungary, spoke about alien Jews, they meant of all those whose ancestors came from Galicia in the 19th century. This campaign, actually, it was a verbal campaign at that time. This campaign against the Jews from Galicia, this campaign against the Eastern Jews was backed by the theory of Jewish invasion from Galicia in the 19th century. It was Gyula Szekely, one of the most prominent Hungarians of the interwar years, who provided a so-called scientific legitimation to this theory in his famous work, Three Generations, and in his other works. Invasion of Galician Jews was a widely accepted theory in the interwar years. Szekely wrote that contrary to the attitude of the Jews who had been living in Hungary from the early times, the new masses of immigrants who came to Hungary mainly illegal from Galicia in the 19th century did not want to assimilate with Hungarians. They preserved their typical Eastern character. They were and they remained aliens who did not identify themselves with the national aims of the Hungarian nation. They were also charged with blocking the process of assimilation of those Jews who settled in Hungary well before the arrival of these Eastern Jews from Galicia. In general, Galician Eastern Jews were held responsible with all faults of capitalism and also for the defeat in the First World War. Here I have to emphasize that the theory of Jewish invasion from Galicia was a myth. It was a myth. This was proved by statisticians and by historians that this kind of invasion did not exist. Up to now, my colleague Miklós Konrád was the last one who proved that this theory was false. This term, Galician Jews, made ground for claims to get rid of a great number of Jews because they were considered as aliens of Jewish faith. The term Galician Jews was extended to all Jews who were considered undesirable, unwanted by the regime. I'm speaking on the Horthy regime. I'm speaking about the Horthy regime. For example, Jews who were involved in the activity of the first communist dictators in 1919, they were also called Galicians, although nobody investigated the origins of Jewish communist leaders of the first communist dictatorship in Hungary. In late 1990 and in 1920, influential organizations and politicians promoted the expulsion of unwanted Jews from Hungary. The Association of Awakening Hungarians was the most influential and strongest political organization with hundreds of thousands of members and sympathizers. On November 30th, 1990, in a rally of this organization, the public speaker, Gyula Zákány, who was the leader of this organization, promoted the removal of all Jews from Hungary. Later, the organization limited their goal to the removal of those Jews who originated from Galicia. Bishop Ottokár Prohászka, in early 1920, Bishop Ottokár Prohászka, who was the spiritual leader of the Christian national Horthy regime, in the House of Representatives initiated the removal of Galician Jews to the national home of Jews, Palestine. In January 1920, at the House of the Representatives, the Minister of the Interior, István Friedrich, said the following: the first thing we need to do is to rid the country of wars, of Galician Jewish lies. We have nothing to do, who have nothing to do with those Jews who are loyal to the Hungarian nation. I can continue this kind of statements from this era. I spoke on the myth of the invasion of the Galician Jews, and I also told how this theory turned into a political program. But what was the policy of the Hungarian government towards the so-called alien Jews? Minutes of the Council of Ministers and statements of high-ranking state officials clearly tell the intent of the government on this issue. The government wanted to get rid of as many Galician Jews as possible. On 15th of September 1920, Gyula Ferdinand, the Minister of the Interior, said that it would be an interest of the country to expel all Jews who are not Hungarian citizens. Nevertheless, this intention did not materialize because the ministers were afraid of the intervention of the great powers who wouldn't have tolerated this kind of action. What actually happened? In late 1919 and in 1920, at least 4 provisions were released by the Ministry of the Interior about the internment and about the expulsion of unwanted foreigners. Regulations provide that aliens whose presence is against the interest of the country must be expelled. These provisions, except the last one, these provisions did not mention the word Jew or Jewish. It was obvious, however, that the Galician Jews is the target group because those foreigners were considered unwanted, who were involved in communist activity, who profited from the war, who are destructive in economic terms, who endanger the food supply, who organize against the public order, who incite fellow citizens to rebellion. The last regulation, which was released on September 30th, 1920, this was the ill-famed provision 20,000. That was different. It was more direct because it says foreigners of Jewish race who entered the country after 1914, independently of the religious affiliation, have to be expelled, even if they were provided a residence permit. This regulation is a milestone in modern Hungarian history. This is the first time the Jews were officially identified as a race. The first entry of the regulation, of the provision related to those who came after 1914 during the First World War. However, the second entry stated that those Jews would be also expelled who cannot prove with official papers that they legally stay in the country. And Jews who were considered destructive in both economic and political sense also had to face expulsion even though they were in the country legally. In general, the Great Expulsion Project failed mainly because the new owner of Galicia, namely Poland, refused to receive masses of Jews from Hungary. Great powers also opposed forced migration. In 1920, altogether about 10,000 foreign Jews, so-called foreign Jews, were forced to leave Hungary. These were Jews who were caught in raids. Mass migration was blocked, but the problem of the question of alien Jews remained open. The problem had affected a significant part of the Hungarian Jewish community because during the raids, even those Jews who were born in Hungary were arrested. In practice, the Ministry of the Interior decided who was alien and who was not. Jews who were unable to prove their Hungarian citizenship remained vulnerable and potentially subject to removal. In Romania, there were 2 groups of alien Jews. Jews who lived in the new territories in Bessarabia, Bukovina, and in Transylvania belonged to one group. So the Romanian political elite made a distinction between the Jews who lived in the territory of the Old Kingdom and Jews who lived in the New Territory. Those Jews who lived in the territory of the Old Kingdom was called so-called our Jews. They were our Jews, and those Jews who lived in the new territories, they were called foreigners or foreign Jews. And there is a second group of alien Jews in Romania. The second group of aliens were Jews who moved to Romania during the First World War, mainly from Russia. Their numbers were exaggerated the same way as in Hungary during the last year of the war. Romanian nationalists spoke about hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from the East, while their real number hardly exceeded 50,000. In 1920, the Romanian government passed a decree about the removal of those Jews who infiltrated to the country after 1914 and who were not Romanian citizens. It was not clear whether this decree was applied only to refugees or also to those Jews who lived in the new territory. It was sure, however, that the most famous Romanian poet and writer, Octavian Goga, who was Minister of State in 1920, advocated for the removal of all Jews in the new territories who could not prove their Romanian citizenship. The problem was, however, that conditions of citizenship were not clearly specified. The Romanian policy towards so-called alien Jews and towards the refugees is quite similar to the policy of the Hungarian regime toward the Galician Jews. The problem of statelessness, the problem of citizenship became a major issue in the Paris Peace Conference. The victorious great powers did not want that masses of people remain stateless. In the new and in the renewed countries in East Central Europe, the Committee of Jewish Delegation demanded that in the framework of the peace treaties and in the framework of minority protection treaties, emancipation in general and the citizenship in particular should be guaranteed for the Jews. Representatives of the Western powers accepted this argument, and it seemed that the so-called Jewish question in East Central Europe was solved forever. The concept was that each citizen automatically should get citizenship of the country where the citizen stays permanently. In this way, no citizen remains stateless. This concept was implemented in the Trianon Peace Treaty. Article 56 says, Hungary admits and declares to be Hungarian nationals all persons possessing rights of citizenship, pertinenza, within Hungarian territory. The problem is the meaning of this word, Italian word, pertinenza. It is very difficult to explain the meaning of this strange word, this strange expression. It is not easy to explain it in English. It could be translated into English as municipal residence or municipal residency or right of residence. I use the term municipal residence. It is not easy to explain the meaning of this term. We do not use it in Hungary since 1949. This term, municipal residence, expresses a special relationship between a person and a settlement. It is not equal with residence. Special relationship could mean tax payment. Somebody pays tax to a given settlement, or somebody relates to a settlement because he or she was born there. But in Hungary, nobody had official documentation about having municipal residence. Hungarian citizens could ask for this certificate from the local government, from local authorities. but it was extremely difficult to prove that the applicant was entitled to the certificate about municipal residence. The process could take years. In 1929, finally, the Ministry of the Interior released a decree that the possession of certificate about municipal residence did not automatically result in the recognition of Hungarian citizenship. Therefore, the Article 56 did not solve the problem of citizenship. But there is another article about citizenship. It is Article 57. It says, all persons born in Hungarian territory who are not born nationals of another state shall ipso facto become Hungarian nationals. It was easy to circumvent this provision too. Hungarian authorities considered unwanted Jews, considered Eastern Jews, Galician Jews, as Polish or Russian citizens. In Hungary, anyone was recognized as a Hungarian citizen, especially in the case of Jews who could prove their citizenship with a certificate issued by the Ministry of the Interior. This approach was enforced when policemen searched for foreigners in raids. This approach was legalized or confirmed by the provision of the Ministry of the Interior released in 1940. The provision said that only those could be considered as Hungarian citizens if they can prove it. In the case of citizenship, despite the Trianon Peace Treaty, the citizenship law, the citizenship law, which was released in 1879, was effective. So this made the question of citizenship even more complex, because according to the citizenship law, and I know I'm speaking the citizenship law, which was released in 1879. So according to the citizenship law, anyone born to Hungarian citizens are Hungarian citizens. It meant that the place of birth had nothing to do with citizenship. When somebody applied for a certificate about his or her Hungarian citizenship, authorities asked the applicant to prove that his or her ancestors back to 3 generations permanently stayed in Hungary. Applicants had to submit birth and marriage certificates of their parents and grandparents. And this was difficult for Jews because in many settlements, rabbinates had no records before 1850s. Orthodox Jews often could not provide marriage certificates. Instead, they provided ketubah, namely marriage agreement issued by the member of the Jewish community. But the marriage agreement was not accepted as a legal document by the Hungarian authorities. And here I would like to, unfortunately, I cannot enlarge, I cannot magnify this official paper. It is from 1950, and an applicant, a Jewish applicant, asked the rabbinate in Tolna to prove that his grandparents was born in Tolna in 1848. And actually, the applicant is a relative of my wife. And I found this paper in the archive of the family. So anyway, what was the reply of the rabbi? The reply was that unfortunately he was unable to prove that the grandparents of the applicants lived in Tolna because they have no reports. They have no birth certificates before 1852. So anyway, it was very easy to create stateless Hungarian Jews by state authorities. In the peace talks, in the Paris peace talks, Romania was supposed to sign a minority protection treaty. It included that Romania automatically recognized as Romanian citizens those persons who stayed in the territory of Transylvania and Bukovina at the time when the treaty went into effect. Under the pressure of the Committee of Jewish Delegation, the Minority Protection Treaty also included a clause that declared that Romania recognized as Romanian citizens all Jews who were living in its territory. The Romanian delegation refused to sign this Minority Protection Treaty because it did not fit the nation-building plans of Greater Romania. When the great powers declared that in case of refusal, the territorial enlargement of the country would be reconsidered, representatives of Romania finally signed the Minority Protection Treaty. But the treaty, as in case of Hungary, did not bring solution to the problem of citizenship of Jews who lived in the new Romanian territories. The Citizenship Law, the Romanian Citizenship Law, which was published in 1924, declared that Romanian citizens had to possess municipal residence within the territory of Bukovina and Bessarabia. So now we see again this expression municipal residence. It was transferred from the Trianon Peace Treaty to the Minority Protection Pact, Minority Protection Treaty, which was signed by the representatives of Romania in Paris. This citizenship law used this complicated term. The citizenship law declared that the possession of municipal residence is important. However, or in other words, those people were not eligible for Romanian citizenship who did not possess municipal residence or who do not possess a paper on municipal residence. Hungarian Jewish daily paper Új Kelet commented on the citizenship law in the following way. The new law will deprive hundreds of thousands of people of their fundamental right to be official citizens. There are hundreds of thousands in this country who can prove only with extreme difficulties or who cannot prove at all that they have municipal residence. It was the duty of the citizens to provide the relevant documents to the local authorities if they wanted their citizenship confirmed or recognized. But even people who collected and submitted the relevant documents could not be sure about the recognition of their Romanian citizenship. Positive decisions of Romanian authorities about citizenship were often opposed by nationalist groups, and in general, their claims were taken into account. In autumn 1924, only in Kolozsvár, Cluj, the capital of Transylvania, more than 3,000 positive decisions about citizenship of Jews were revoked because of the attacks, because of the opposition of nationalist organizations. According to the estimates of the Alliance of Romanian Jews, about 30% of Jews in the country had no citizenship. We are speaking about the 20s. Most of the stateless Jews in Romania were Hungarian Jews who lived in Transylvania. And let's speak some words on Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, political anti-Semitism was a marginal phenomenon until the mid-30s. Czechoslovakia, the Minority Protection Treaty was also accepted by Czechoslovakia, and the Minority Protection Treaty was signed on September 1919, and this treaty declared that each citizen who lived in the country and who had municipal residence were automatically entitled to citizenship. The situation was about the same as in Romania and in Hungary. When applying for citizenship certificate, the applicant had to prove that he or she had municipal residence. The applicant had to prove that his or her ancestors paid tax in 1871, and they permanently stayed in Czechoslovak territory in the last 100 years. It was almost impossible, it was very difficult for Jews to provide these documents because rabbinates began to document birth and marriage certificates and began to document birth and marriages only since 1850. I began my talk with the first Hungarian deportation. And now at the end of my talk, I would like to return to this subject. I mentioned that it was a fundamental aim of both Hungarian and Romanian political elites to get rid of the so-called alien Jews. It was impossible. It was impossible in the interwar era. It was impossible to implement this program during the interwar years. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the situation dramatically changed. There were places to settle these unwanted so-called alien Jews. In Hungary, as I mentioned, in August 1941, about 20,000 alien Jews, so-called alien Jews, were deported to the occupied territory of Germany. About 150,000 Jews from Bessarabia and from Bukovina were expelled to territories which were occupied by Romanian and the German army. And these Jews, these deported alien Jews, became the first victims of the Holocaust. Since they were killed, they were slaughtered by German special units. So I underline again that these alien Jews, so-called without citizenship, became the first victims of the Holocaust in Romania and in Hungary. So thank you for your attention.
Here we are again. Thank you so much, Tamás. As always, extremely thorough research and an important story. To be frank with you, most of that story I didn't know. Okay, but that's the point of great research, right? Because I had a kind of a bigger picture, but the way you laid it out, I was not familiar with that in that level of detail. So for me, it was really excellent, and I appreciate it very much. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we have it's 10:54 Eastern Daylight Time. So that means we have time for some questions. I have the and by the way, you use the Q&A box for questions, everybody, so that we can get started. Hang on, I need to turn that off so that doesn't make that sound, everybody. Okay. Let me just shut this down here. There we are. So I'd love for someone to get the ball rolling and start with a question. That would really, I can ask the first question, but it's nicer when someone from the audience does so. We have a question, and it's nice because the two first questions, Tamás, you can see them at questions too, but Jennifer Leclerc is a former student here, and Susan Papp, of course, is a colleague here. So I'll go with just in order here. Jennifer Leclerc, and Tamás, you read them too, but I'm just reading them just for the context for the audience. Given that representatives of the Hungarian Jewish community, at the request of the government, refrained from turning to the League of Nations after the so-called numerous clauses law, and that it was the first Jewish law passed in post-World War I Europe, do you believe that if there had been greater reaction in the international arena to its effects of silently designating Hungarian Jewry as a racial national minority, that this could have impacted the future anti-Semitic laws in Hungary? Jennifer, a very terrific question, just like always. Thanks, Jennifer. Over to you, Dr. Stark.
I think I try to reply to this
Very good question.
to this complex question.
Yeah.
First of all, yes, the Hungarian Jewish community did not turn to the League of Nations at all.
Mhm.
And so it was a part of the, it was a fundamental attitude of the Hungarian Jewish community not to speak out, not to turn to foreign countries, not to complain, not to turn to the League of Nations, not to turn to foreign countries, not to ask assistance of a foreign power, because the main charge against the Hungarian Jewish community was that they were not Hungarians. They are foreigners, because according to the anti-Semitic views of the regime, the Jews did not belong to the Hungarian nation in general. But it's also important to emphasize that the political elite, the representatives of the regime, made distinction between those Jews who assimilated to the Hungarian nation and those Jews who were considered Eastern Jews, whose ancestors came from Galicia. But the whole Jewish community was considered so-called as an alien body in Hungary.
Right.
But of course, the Hungarian Jewish community, the official representatives of the Hungarian Jewish community, did their best to prove that they are very good Hungarians. And for this reason, it would have been very counterproductive to complain and to turn to the League of Nations. So it did not happen, but it is true. But it is true, that international Jewish organization turned to the League of Nations, and when this first anti-Jewish regulation was introduced in Hungary in 1920, which practically blocked the entrance of Jewish students to university, or reduced the number of Jewish students in university. So that was the essence of the so-called first Jewish law introduced in 1920. When this law was introduced, international Jewish organizations turned to the League of Nations, and that great procession began in 1920, and it ended. I'm not sure, but it ended in the mid-20s. And it was a successful campaign, because finally the Hungarian government revoked this so-called first Jewish law or regulation. So this is I do not know whether I can answer.
Yeah, I think in terms of, I think it was 1928 when that law.
1928. Yes, that was the last time when the representative of the Hungarian government spoke about or tried to explain the policy, and he promised the revoke of this regulation released in 1920.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. No, and Jennifer, thanks like always for such a terrific question. It's a good indication of the strength of students at the University of Toronto, Tamás, because that's a former student at, in fact, not just the University of Toronto, but this center as well. So our mutual friend, Susan Papp, has a question. And, you know, just anecdotally, I think it was Dr. Papp who introduced us, Tamás, when you were, you know, so many years ago when you were coming over from Rochester. So, and Susan's looking for more information on your sources. So kindly describe your wide variety of sources, particularly in dealing with the Goga regime and Czechoslovakia's discriminatory citizenship laws. Thanks for this very enlightening presentation. And then I've got a couple more after that, Tamás. Over to you.
So about the source?
Yeah, just, you know, yeah. Susan, again, mutual friend, is looking for a little bit more detail on your sources. That's the essence, and particularly in dealing with the Goga regime and Czechoslovakia's discriminatory citizenship laws.
Yes, I have to mention one important source, and this source, the press, the media. So I went through the actually almost all Hungarian papers which were published in Romania in the interwar years.
Mm-hmm.
Újkelet was the main publication, because that was but it was not the only Hungarian Jewish publication. That was a daily publication. So it was an intensive work to go through to study the papers which came out in Hungarian, in Romania, in the interwar. I concentrated on Jewish papers, and I did the same in case of Czechoslovakia. Yeah. It is interesting that in Transcarpathia, about 5 Jewish papers were circulating in the interwar years. And I went through one Hungarian Jewish paper, and I also tried to study Jewish papers which were written in other languages. But so the press was one of my main sources, but I also studied scholarly literature, and I also studied the document of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. When I was a Fulbright Fellow at Rochester a couple of years ago, I went to New York to the archives of the Joint, and I went through their materials, and I also studied various English papers, Jewish English papers, which were published in the interwar years. So these were my sources.
Excellent. Yes. It should, you know, the research shows an extraordinary use of a variety of sources, as always, Tamás. This is from a future student, actually. I believe she's out west right now. This is very specific, but I'm wondering what Bella Kuhn's policies on Jewish citizenship were.
Yeah.
Very short period, but it's a good question.
Yeah, that's interesting. First of all, Bela Kuhn had a Jewish background, but he did not identify himself with this Jewish background. But his attitude was that I was born as Jewish, but I turned to be a communist. Yeah. So he identified himself with communism, and not with and he denied his Jewish background, and that was the attitude of actually each communist leader. But it was interesting that what was the policy of the communist dictatorship towards the aliens, and it was interesting because they also tried to drive out foreign Jews from the country. They also wanted to expel foreigners and foreign Jews. From this aspect, the communist policy was about the same as the policy of the Horthy regime. I did not study specifically this subject, but it would be interesting to study why the communist power wanted to get rid of the so-called foreign Jews, but actually nothing happened because they had no opportunity to remove foreigners at all. So, but nothing happened. But they wanted, and that was part of their policy to get rid of foreigners in general. Yes.
But Tamás, if you were to speculate, because as you said, you haven't looked at it that closely. If you were to speculate on the motivations behind Kuhn and his other commissars regarding foreign nationals and the hostility you've already mentioned, what do you think was motivating them? Because it seems a bit at odds. It's not something that's obvious.
I think that they were aware of the anti-refugee attitude of the public. They were aware of the anti-Galician, of the anti-Eastern Jew feeling of the general public, and they wanted to serve this feeling. They wanted to supply this feeling. So mainly I think that mainly for propaganda reason, they accepted this feeling and they spoke about the necessity of the removal of foreigners in general and Jews in particular. But this is only a speculation.
Okay, yeah, because again, it's not. It doesn't seem. I didn't know that, by the way, that they had that policy. To me, it seems.
But actually, nothing really happened, and this was not the removal of foreigners. It was not a major issue at all. I read it in a newspaper. It was mentioned in some kind of a statement, but it was not a major issue at all. Anyway.
Well, let me just ask you a question, which is more related to how, and it comes from Isabel's question about Bela Kun, right? Which is, when you look at the general histories of Hungary, and I'm taking from a very specific research question that you've just examined here, and then I'm going to ask a bit more of a general question. The fate of the Jews after the First World War, if you look at a general, I'm thinking of a book like, let's say, for example, Laszlo Kontler's Millennium, okay, which is actually, I think, a really beautiful book. And again, he was never a Hungarian historian, but mostly a historian of Scotland, to be frank. And then, of course, Lenvai's book, which I also quite like, to be frank, which is The Hungarians 1,000 Years. And then there's Brian Cartledge, which is, he's a former UK diplomat who wrote a and Norman Stone, I don't know if you read it, Tamás, did a new, much more shorter version, which I found very unsatisfactory, by the way. But in terms of how they portray this period and the fate of the Jews, so much hinges on this intervention of Jews into Hungarian political life, which came with Bela Kun. And I put Jews in quotation marks, right? Because as you alluded to, Kun never, that's not how he identified himself. But how accurate is that entry into politics becomes such a monumental turning point in overall Hungarian attitudes towards the Jewish community, that it was as if they had crossed a red line, that everything was okay in Hungarian society except for politics, and that the Kun revolution and the 133-day dictatorship is just too much, and that's the transformative moment, because that's what you get out of certain general textbooks. And I find that a bit of an oversimplification of Hungarian attitudes towards not just foreign Jews, okay, not just the categories that you created here or alien Jews, but the Jewish population in general, which would include, so-called Budapest Jews who, of course, fate in throughout the interwar period was very different than the communities that you largely studied in the presentation. Does that make sense, Tamás, what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah. It's a widespread opinion that the turning point was the first communist dictatorship. It was a turning point.
Yeah.
In the change, it was a turning point in the change of the attitude of greater Hungarian public towards the Jews. But I think it is only part of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Because the anti-Jewish so-called anti-Jewish movement began probably during at the second half of the First World War. It began. It began at that time.
Okay.
It began when the first cartoon showed up.
Yeah.
Because first anti-Jewish cartoon turned up in various Hungarian papers. When members of the parliament began to speak about, began to portray Jews in general as war profiteers, and not only refugees were portrayed as war profiteers, but almost the whole Hungarian Jewry. And when members of the parliament mentioned that 100,000 refugees flooded Hungary, or hundreds of thousands of refugees came, they meant by that, I think, not just the refugees, but the whole Hungarian Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
The whole Hungarian Jewish community. And a significant part of the Hungarian political elite and the scholarly elite began to see the Jews as a community which do not really belong to the Hungarian nation.
Right.
And that attitude began actually in 1917. There was a questionnaire circulated in 1970 in a famous journal, 20th Century. This was the name of the journal. The questionnaire was circulated. Actually, the questionnaire was made and was circulated by Oscar Jászai and his group. And the main question was that what is your opinion about the Hungarian Jewish community? Does anti-Semitism exist in Hungary? That was the questionnaire. And that questionnaire was sent to probably 30 high-ranking Hungarian, not state officials, but intellectuals.
Right.
And the result was published. And it is very interesting to study the result of this questionnaire. So you can read it. It came out in the last issue of the 20th Century in 1917. And the outcome of this research was that probably 70% of those Hungarian intellectuals who were approached with this question replied that the Hungarian Jews are not really part of the nation. They do not really belong to the nation. And probably 30% of Hungarian intellectuals wrote that Jewish question did not really exist.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of the intellectuals replied that yes, there is a question, and Jews are not really Hungarian. And that was before, and that was well before the communist dictatorship. So I think that the communist dictatorship generated this anti-Jewish feeling or anti-Jewish complex.
Mm-hmm.
It added to this already existing anti-Jewish complex. But it was not the turning point. I think it was not but it was a contribution. Definitely, it was a contribution since 1919. The Jews, the Jews were identified with communism, with communist activity, with the Soviet Union. So you know the story.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's where just to be clear, this survey you mentioned, or questionnaire as you called it, where do I find the research on that? You alluded to it, and then maybe Susan wants to know, or maybe Susan knows it. But
on this journal, 20. század, 20th century.
Okay.
And I wrote about it, and so, but there are Professor Braham, I think. Professor Braham also mentioned the survey, or I can mention Viktor Karadi.
Okay.
Viktor Karadi, he also mentioned, or András Kovács.
Okay.
speaking about Hungarian historians, but this survey is quite well documented, and it is very interesting.
Okay, no, I'll look into that because again, 99% of what you said this morning or this afternoon for you, wasn't front and center for me. I'm going to give you one more question from the chat, from the Q&A box. I mean, are you looking at that question?
I cannot read, or can you read it?
Yeah. Look, I'm working at university, but I find the question a bit strange. The person's asking if there's a parallel between Bella Kun and George Soros, and I don't think I don't see anything there. But that's.
But just I would like to add only one sentence to this question of the survey. It was interesting. I read the memoir of the head of the Jewish community. And the memoir was written during the Holocaust. Actually, not at the beginning of the Holocaust. I think it was written 1941 or 1942. And it was written that anti-Jewish campaign was launched by Oscar Yassi because of this survey, because this survey really deteriorated the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in Hungary. It was very interesting that he blamed Yassi Oscar for the beginning. I think he was not right anyway. He was not, but it was but it was so important, it was so powerful, I mean, the survey and its impact.
Yeah. And it's a part, by the way, it's a part of Oscar Yassi's career that I did not know about. Okay.
It's interesting, actually. I did not know about this story before my research, so I was not familiar with these facts. So I put years to this research.
Yeah, because we usually associate him with such the policies of the government with that came in 1918, right?
Yeah.
And certainly, I don't know his career so well prior to that, right? Okay, but that's an interesting fact. Okay. Well, unless we have anything else from the audience, I'm gonna probably, well, we have a couple more minutes. Almos Tasuni, who's a nice friend, says, "Thank you, most interesting." And I sending greetings to Almos. He's almost a neighbor of mine. He doesn't live that far from me, but I haven't seen him like everybody, Tamás. I haven't seen him in a long time, right? So greetings, Almos, and let's hope I'll see you wandering our halls of Trinity College soon enough. Okay. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a great morning, and I hope it was a nice afternoon for you, Tamás. We have a long weekend here. That's why we rescheduled for today and not tomorrow. Tomorrow is President's Day, and that's in honor of the President of the University of Toronto, or a President Day or something. So tomorrow's a holiday, and Monday is our most famous holiday, which is Victoria Day. Okay.
Monday is holiday for here also.
Yeah?
Yes, because it's Pentecost here.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Monday, tomorrow we work, but Monday will be holiday because of Pentecost, actually.
Excellent. So but just quickly, just give me a bird's eye view. What's the scene in Budapest in terms of this nasty pandemic? Are things opening up? Give us a quick snapshot of life in the Hungarian capital for us.
The restaurants are open, and so we can go to restaurants now, but it is free to visit the balcony of restaurants, and those can visit the inner side of the restaurant who have a so-called a vaccination card. So we received the card who went through the vaccination, or who went through the virus infection, received the so-called green card. And with this green card, we can enter to the restaurant. Without green card, we can remain outside the restaurant. We can use the balcony. And public transport works, and but it is still compulsory to wear the face mask. It is compulsory to wear face mask everywhere in Hungary, and there was a lockdown. For months, but the lockdown was lifted probably 3 weeks ago.
Mhm.
And from the point of victims, unfortunately, almost 30,000 Hungarians died because of the pandemic. So that's unfortunately that's a tragic number. But on the other hand, and the government tried to propagate another figure that almost 40% of Hungarians received vaccination. So that's true, but it is also a political issue, the vaccination, because half of Hungarians received Chinese and Russian vaccine, while the Western vaccines are more popular. I mean, the Moderna, the Pfizer, even AstraZeneca. Actually, I received AstraZeneca. So, but 50% of Hungarians receive vaccination, and I hope that the life will be normal in a couple of weeks. But actually, we historians, we are in home office. The Institute of History closed in March. We are still in home office.
Yeah, and when you say closed in March, you mean March 2020?
No, actually, so we started home office last March.
Yeah.
But we returned to the institute in autumn, and the second home office began at the beginning of March this year.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a bit. We haven't been, I don't know. I come to the office periodically, but not. I'm one of the few people who comes, right?
So we can go to the office, but we were told to stay at home. But the office is not really closed, so we have an access to our books and we have an access to the computer. But we were told that it would be better to remain at home. And no official programs. I mean, no official live programs.
Yeah, same here. We hope to get back to that. We're hoping. I'm planning some live events already in October, so we'll see. Right? Fingers crossed. I tend to be a glasses half full person, so I wish you well, Tamás. It was so good to see you this morning, and it was nice to meet your wife too. And look forward to and give her our best regards. Maybe she's around still. I hope she enjoyed the talk. I know I did, and as I said, you're a good friend, and for me it's a pleasure to see you, and you always enrich us here, and we're grateful for that. So we stay in touch. Enjoy your long weekend. To my nice audience, thank you for your terrific questions, and enjoy the long weekend. I hope the weather's good for everybody and that everybody can get outside, and that we are soon functioning a little closer to normal than we have been in the past little while. So there's the Tamás's wife. Nice to see you. Greetings to the two of you. I hope you have a nice evening tonight. It's already, what is it, 5:30 there. So enjoy. Maybe go and have a coffee at the terrace at the Gerlotzi, my favorite cafe.
Okay.
If you go, tell them, if you go, the management there, the concierge, maitre d' grand poobah, as we say, is a guy named Chaba, with a mustache like you, Tamás. You tell him that Robert's saying hello, and Tibor is the.
What is the name of the place?
His first name is Chaba.
Okay. And what is the name of the place?
Oh, Gerlotzi.
Gerlotzi. Okay.
Yeah. Right there, and it's a nice. They have a beautiful terrace. You can have a coffee and a cake in the way that only the Hungarians know how to do properly.
Okay.
Take care, you two.